Hello, how are you? I hope everyone is gesund, stark, und freilich, begashmis und beruchnis. I hope everyone is healthy, strong, and happy physically, spiritually. As usual, in the past couple of weeks, our hearts and minds are with our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael. We're in the midst of a war. Hashem Yirachim. We should all come to peace and health. All the hostages should be returned healthy, and the war should stop now. As usual in the past couple of weeks, we've added to the usual prayer and Torah with tzedakah. So here we're going to give tzedakah, gdeilah tzedakah, shemevi esagula. Tzedakah brings the redemption and Mashiach. Now we'll go to a prayer, and we've already said this pasuk before, this prayer, and it's directly related to what we're going to talk about in the parsha, and it's directly related to the war. And the pasuk is a pasuk in Tilim, Kapitel Ches, Pasuk Gimel, Mi piyoylelim v'yoyin ki misadet oiz, Leman tzedirecho lahash b'soyev u'misnakeim. From the mouths of babes and sucklings, you have established your might to counter your enemies, to silence foe and avenger. As we've spoken before, the Jewish nation has a special power in the voices of the children. Hevel tinoik Hashem bechet, and the Medrash says, it's brought down in the Gemara, that over here it's also referring to the children who, by the splitting of the Red Sea, that even the children saw, Heimikirut Chila, they recognized God, and they said, Zeh Keli Vanveyu. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, in the years where he was fighting for Judaism itself against the communist regime, he was very strong into pushing the idea of chedarim, teachers, melamdim, learning Torah with young children, aleph beis, simple aleph beis, and verses of the Chumash. And he was really, really powerful in pushing this and saying, from the mouth of babes and infants, we will have the power to overcome our enemies. Now, this is going to be related to our situation now. We have to push as much as we can children to say psukim and pray, but also this is also in a way a verse which brings out the virtues of Jewish mothers, and that's going to be the focus of today's talk, connected to Parshas Vayechi, because the Jewish mothers that are much, much exceedingly more bonded with the child in the first 5 years of the child's life in comparison to the father. You can't even compare it, obviously. The child nurses from the mother, the child spends more time with the mother. It's only when it says, Mishatinik, which when the child begins to talk, then of Malamde Torah, the father teaches the child Torah. But who is the one that's essentially really deeper connected? And obviously from the fact that the mother gives birth to the child, which there's nothing that compares to that. And she has to go to the labor pains, carry the child for 9 months, etc., etc. So that creates a bond which is much more deeper and powerful than the bond between a father and a child. And that's the way it is al pi Torah, and this we'll discuss it today a bit. So in this week's Parsha, there's a very interesting point that some people do not focus so much on, and that's the story where Yaakov is talking to Yosef and making Yosef swear that he will bury Yaakov in Eretz Yisrael. And he starts talking to his son, and Yaakov senses that Yosef might have a grievance. And what's the grievance? That Yaakov, it sounds like a bit of a hypocrite, Chas v'shalom, to use such a harsh word. Yaakov himself didn't bury Yosef's mother, Yaakov's beloved, his wife, in the Moras HaMachpelah. And here he's asking Yosef to bury Yaakov, his father, in Hebron. And therefore the pasuk says, in the beginning of Vayechi, as Yaakov is discussing this with Yosef, V'ani bevoi mipadan mesolai Rachel. Rachel passed away be'eretz Canaan, but derech ba'oid kivras eretz, lovoi Ephrosa, the Ekbar Hashem b'derech Ephros, he Beis Lochem. He buried her in Beis Lochem. And Rashi explains over here that he's explaining why Yaakov is telling this to Yosef, even though I trouble you to take me to be buried in the land of Canaan, because it's a major operation to go from Eretz Canaan from Mitzrayim, who Yosef is the viceroy, to come to take Yaakov to Eretz Canaan. And but I did not do those so for your mother. So therefore, Yaakov explains, he continues further, Rashi over here, that I didn't even take her to Beis Lechem, to bring her into the land. I know that there are hard feelings in your heart against me. And here he gives the explanation why he did it. You should know, it was by the word of Hashem that I did it. Shetela Ezra Levanea, so she should be of aid to her children. When Uzardan exiled them, he was the chief general of Nebuchadnezzar, and when the Beis Hamikdash, the first Beis Hamikdash, was destroyed, he led the Jews into exile. They would pass through by way of Rachel's tomb. Rachel go out al kibra onto her grave, uvoicha and weep, uvakeshes aleim rachmim, and seek mercy for them. Shenemar kol berama nishma v'goymer, a voice is heard in the heights. And then the Eibishter answers her, yes, sachal u'pulasech, no Hashem, there was reward for your act. V'shavu vonim l'gvulam, and the children shall return to their borders. So what I'm going to say, the basis, is taken from a Lakutei Sichos, volume 30. Just a kernel of the idea of what I'm going to speak about today. And over here, the obvious question is, it's very, very interesting that we talk about Rachel. And this might be your greatest achievement. And there's no mention of it whatsoever before, where Rachel actually passes away, as we had before in Parshas Vayishlach. It just says Vayisum beis Kel and Vayihiba Ksheisod belidata. She had pains when she was giving birth. Vayihiba tzeis nafsha kimesa, and Vatomas Rachel Vatikover b'derech efrosa hi beis lachem. It just says the Yaakov buried her right there. Doesn't give any explanations and doesn't say nothing. So you could ask the question, first of all, why now this whole point that Yaakov is bringing up? What happened years before? That's number one. And that's why you could say Rashi has to give this whole story here, because he senses the double standard, it seems, that when Yaakov is asking Yosef to do what he's doing, Yosef might have a grievance. So therefore, the story comes over here. And the Rebbe explains, it's a Rashi Sikha, different commentaries, what they say, and why Rashi, the way he's learning Rashi, the Rebbe explains Rashi, it's a bit a different point. So one thing the Rebbe explains, which is a beautiful point in life in general, is that Rashi writes over here that Yosef had something in his heart against Yaakov, meaning to say that obviously, he understood, Yosef understood that whatever Yaakov does was 100% the correct thing, because Yaakov is a tzaddik, Yosef is a chassid, Yosef himself is a tzaddik, ben tzaddik, and of course he knows that what Yaakov did, that buried Rachel over there on the spot, was 100% correct. But still, Rashi says the Lashon that Yaakov says, "V'yadaiti sheyesh belibcha olai," which means that even though on an intellectual level, to a certain, and generally you understand, obviously, that Yosef understood that Yaakov did the right thing, but as long as you don't explain it, as long as you don't reframe it, then okay, you accept it. Like in Kabbalah, in a Kabbalah. I'm not going to double question Rabbi. Sometimes your master does something, your Rebbe does something, you don't really understand it. I call it, let's say, for example, if the Rebbe says something I don't understand, I call it Rebbe stuff. So Yosef could have had in his mind, this is like Rebbe stuff. Yaakov did it. Obviously, he knew what he was doing, and you believe in it. But still, as long as you didn't really get to the core of the issue, to transform it, a paradigm shift, so then, yesh belibcha olai, because even though on a general way, you understood that it's the right thing, but still, because we don't get to the root of it, there might be some sort of slight, subtle feeling like if only maybe whatever. So therefore Yaakov has to explain, my friends, this was no loss at all. Rachel didn't mind at all. It wasn't for any other reason. Because I was in a hurry, because I couldn't take all... Many of the commentators explained different things. But not because I was in shock, not because I couldn't take all the children with me to Hebron. The reason I did it is because I got a command, I got a message from Hashem, that this is what is meant to happen. And knowing Rachel, of course, this is what Rachel wants. And why? This is a win-win. Because of this act of Rachel giving away her place in the Moras HaMachpelah, she was able to bring benefit to the most important cause, Machshavta sheYisrael Kodma L'Chol Davar, to the most important cause, which is the Jewish nation, in the most important hour, when they're in the abyss, when they're in exile. So now, to really appreciate this word, let's go to the original Medrash, which brings down this story. And how much you thought that this is so amazing, but wait, there's more. It's an astonishing medrash. There's a medrash in Eicha that goes like this, where it brings down this whole story. And it says that when there was the Churban Beis HaMikdash, which is the greatest disaster in a certain sense, of the massacres of Yidden, and the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, Hashem's house. So much so that the Gemara talks about how the sages for a certain time took out Ata Gibar, etc. And the Gemara has to say, Hein Gvuresav. In other words, how could Hashem allow that his own house should be destroyed and desecrated in such a fashion? And Avram and Yitzchak and Yaakov and Moshe Rabbeinu come and weep and cry and plead with Hashem himself. And it doesn't stop the decree. And it doesn't guarantee the return. As we're saying these days, bring them home. The hostages, the captives, the terrible, crushing destruction of the Churban and exile. And after Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe Rabbeinu plead with Hashem, it's Rachel and Rachel's cries and pleading that does it. And let me first read to you this medrash, and let's try to understand it. And the medrash says as follows: at that time, Rachel right away appeared before Hashem. Yaakov, my husband, he loved me with a great love. He worked for 7 years to be able to marry me. When he finished working those 7 years, when I was supposed to marry my husband, my father Lavan, who was a con man, he was not straight. He was the ultimate of a dodgy person. And he wanted to switch me, to play a trick on Yaakov. And it bothered me very, very much. I found out about it. So and Yaakov and Rachel knew who they're dealing with. Lavan is a trickster. Lavan is a sly, dishonest person. And they understood that he's going to try this trick. So Rachel initially made a signal of signs with Yaakov that in case Lavan will try to exchange them, switch Leah to Rachel, instead of Rachel, Yaakov will know the signs, so he shouldn't be fooled, and therefore Lavan's plot will fail. And therefore they made up certain signals and signs between themselves, Yaakov and Rachel. So I gave I gave Yaakov the signs, but then I came and I realized what's going to happen. I swallowed my desires, my personal interests, and I had mercy on my sister, because if Yaakov would expose Leah on that night, which is meant to be the wedding night for Leah, that she's going to marry this tzaddik Yaakov, and then she would be so publicly humiliated, embarrassed. I couldn't allow myself, Rachel is saying, I couldn't allow it to happen. I don't want it should be exposed, that everyone will see that she's not the one. So I decided, I told her all the signs, so that Yaakov should think it's Rachel. The Medrash continues a bit more. The bottom line is, Rachel did everything that she shouldn't become embarrassed or humiliated. And now Rachel turned to Hashem. I wasn't jealous for my own concerns and how I was going to be hurt. Rachel is saying, I swallowed my interest and my desires so that my sister shouldn't become embarrassed and humiliated and ashamed in public. But you, sorry, me that I'm immortal of flesh and blood and ashes and dust, and I wasn't jealous. I didn't look at my personal grievance. I overlooked it so that my sister shouldn't get embarrassed. Rachman, you are the King of Kings and you are eternal. You're not of flesh and blood and you have infinite mercy. You're getting jealous on the idols that the Jews worship instead of you. And my children have been exiled and murdered by the sword, and their enemies have done with them according to their whatever they want. Immediately Hashem's mercies were flowing, and Hashem said, because of you, Rachel, I will return the Jews to the place. There's a voice that's heard on high by Hashem. Nehi bechi samrudim. The voice of bitter weeping. Rachel mavakal b'nei. Rachel is weeping over her children. She refuses to be consoled. Al b'nei keinenu. Uchsiv koyamar Hashem. And Hashem says, Minei koylech mibchi. You could restrain yourself from crying. Ve'nayich midimo, and your eyes from tears. Ki yesh socha lepulasech. There's a reward for your actions. Uchsiv yesh tikva lachrisech. You have hope for the future. Nom Hashem v'shovu vonim legvulam, and your children will be returned to the borders. Wow, wow, wow. Where Avram goes and he tries, he fails. Yitzchak tries, also still a fail. Yaakov, Moshe Rabbeinu, Milanu Gadol Mimoshe, and still not. But Rachel is the one who affects it. The change that Hashem turns back the decree, promises her, your words, yes, Sachal Pulasech, not Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Moshe. Rachel is told, yes, Sachal Pulasech, V'shovu Banim L'Gvulam. What is going on over here? Why? How can we understand it? And the explanation is exactly as the Medrash says. Going back to that story of what happened when she gave Leah the signs. That's her schus. So her schus is greater. That there's some quality connected to her Mesiras Nefesh that's greater than the quality of the Mesiras Nefesh of Avram and the Akedah, and greater than the Mesiras Nefesh of Yitzchak and Yaakov and Moshe Rabbeinu. So maybe we could say that the word is, there's a famous saying, we say there's one thing to die al Kiddush Hashem, and there's one thing to live with Mesiras Nefesh. There's a sense of martyrdom, which is a one-off sense of martyrdom where you face an overwhelming foe and you stand strong, and it's an amazing event. The story of the Akedah, many of the stories of Avram Avinu, and in general, the stories of Yaakov. He had a foe from without. That was Esav, that was Lavan. And he had to stand by his principles. So it's about Judaism, Jewish values, and there's the enemy. There's an enemy of Esav, there's an enemy of Lavan. And he has to overcome these enemies to Judaism. And the same thing is Moshe Rabbeinu. The enemy is the Egyptians, the Egyptian culture, or different sort of enemies that were threats to Judaism, like the story with the spies, they're going against God. The story with Korach, they're also going against God. And it's a story. Here's the story. We have to stand strong, and then this too shall pass. No problem. But what's the Mesiras Nefesh here? The Mesiras Nefesh over here, in a certain sense, is in a certain sense, of course, Rachel transcends it, but she's going to have a sacrifice, which is a lifelong, eternal sacrifice. She's going to allow her sister to marry her beloved, and then watch as that relationship also flourishes and grows. And as a matter of fact, as it turned out, Leah was the one who bore all those many children to Yaakov when she hadn't. So here we're dealing with the supreme act of self-abnegation, that this is going to be daily for years. She could have allowed Rachel to be exposed. The whole ruse is up, and she would have Yaakov to herself. What did she do? In order not to embarrass Abbas Yisrael, in order not to cause shame, humiliation for another Jew, it's worth it to put yourself into a position where you might have pain, or it might hurt you, issues of the heart, shot through the heart. And it might be something which is going to be daily, every single day for decades and decades, so to speak. And yet, she was willing to do that. So in general, there's two sorts of self-sacrifice. Besides for the idea that there's a self-sacrifice that's a one-off act, and there's a self-sacrifice which is daily, consistent, there's also the idea that this is something which really cuts deep, the very essence of intimacy and relationship, and how you're sacrificing that for the rest of your life to share it with another person. Now, by the way, I just want to go on to another subject which is interesting, related but not the same exact thing. There's a Jewish concept which is called farginen. I don't know how you translate it in English, but farginen means when the other person has good and you're happy with the other person's joy, with the other person's good fortune. It's interesting. I didn't see anything, I never saw anything written about this explicitly, but we know in life that, many times when you hear about someone else's suffering, you say, you feel bad. So you have that empathy. You can even have empathy, as we'll say in next week's Pasha. You can put yourself in someone else's shoes and feel the pain, what the other person is going through. But you know what? I'm talking now on a personal level. I find it harder when you see someone else who has success, not to have some feeling sometimes inside of you. I struggle with this sometimes. Like, what makes that person, God forbid, I shouldn't be saying this in public, but I'm saying this in the hope that to say that I plan on working on it. It's my resolution from today, that, and the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, writes about this and talks, that Avas Reim, Avas Yisrael means feeling the pain of another. In other words, feeling pain when your friend is in pain. But also rejoicing the other person's simcha. And I find that harder. You can have struggles in many areas of your life, in parnasa, in children, in health, in nachas, whatever it is. And you feel to a certain extent, you're not the most wicked person in the world. I mean, why does it have to be like that? And you look around and you see, and this is like the oldest question in the book, that there's people that you think to yourself, it seems externally, even though you don't really believe it, that it doesn't look like they're all doing the right thing. And by them, there's always these happy endings and good fortune. And when it comes to my life, it seems everything's with a struggle, and it's not going so well. And by them, it just goes and seems like it's easy. So I'm not here to answer that. I'm here to uproot it in the first place. Let us all go in the ways of Rachel, that vergint. But forgetting is like the lowest level. That's not really saying a lot. It doesn't mean you actually have to give up something or sacrifice something. First start on that level. So number one, that's why I said it's related, but nothing compared. Forgetting should be a basic level for every single Jew, and of course for every single chassid. Rejoice in the joy and good fortune of others. That goes without saying. That's like basic level. More than that, we come to the midah of vatronus. And last week we spoke about this by Yehuda. Vatronus means to forego, to acquiesce, to give in. And this is a bit also over here about vatronus. I said this once before. There's a person in Lubavitch, someone I know. He's a bit older than me, and I can't say his name because I don't think he would want I should say his name. But there was a big dispute, that every Lubavitcher knows about this, between two institutions. And this is related to almost every single chassid. To make a long story short, one of the people involved, there's two sides, the person who is the main person on one side told me that he decided to give in. He told me straight from his mouth. And I was so surprised because I would never imagine that he's the type of person that would do this. He's not like a person like from the old school in a way. He's more like a with it person, sophisticated, And I was so surprised. He told me, you should know, Yankee, I want to tell you, from that moment, that day, there was a meeting that the two sides sat down because the Rebbe wanted to hear that they made up. He told me he walked into that meeting and he decided that he's giving in. And he told me from that moment in my life was turned around. My mazel, my good fortune. I was so stunned that he's told this to me. And every time, he lives in another side of the world. I live in Melbourne. From time to time when I see him, I ask him, no, you remember what you told me that time? You still stand by that? And he tells me, absolutely. So this is such an important lesson we have to take to ourselves, to learn from Rachel. First of all, Mesiras Nefesh doesn't mean that we have to measure it by climbing mountains. Sometimes Mesiras Nefesh means when you want to say something about somebody, don't say it. Bite your tongue. Swallow your pride. That's what it means, Mesiras Nefesh. Look at this. The Mesiras Nefesh of Rachel. That she allowed her sister to have the joy at her own expense, Rachel's expense. Her Mesiras Nefesh is greater than the Avodah of Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Moshe. She's the one that stops the decree of Golus. Yes, Sachal Pulasech. And it's because of her Mesiras Nefesh. And it's the same thing with the act of her being buried. We can elaborate on this. We're already late. There's so much more to talk about, so I'll just have to now make it very concise. And that's the same exact point over here. What is the idea of Rachel? She's buried in the roadside. She's not looking after herself at all. She doesn't care about herself. Who does she care about? It's all about the children. That's what motherhood's all about. It's complete, absolute selflessness. I would have such a great spiritual elevation by being in the Maras HaMachpelah. She knew what she was giving up. More than we could even imagine. However, me and you are going to sit and talk about how great it is to be buried in the same place of the Avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Leah, and Adam and Chava. Rachel says, there's something even greater, and that is where my children go, where I'm needed, where I can bring benefit, is much more important. I could have to forget about my own personal rank, my own personal position, my own personal elevation, and I do what's good for my children. And that is the ultimate sacrifice. She was mevater in the story that she gave away the signs to her sister so that she shouldn't be humiliated. She was mevater. She gave away her position, her top spot, her back seat, in the highest of the high. And she gave it away to be buried on a roadside in a moment of destruction, a low, low point in the history of Am Yisrael. And for who? Not for the children that was the goody two-shoes. Not for the children that wins prizes and is the diploma and gets an A+ and is a teacher's pet. She's doing this for the children that did something kaviyachol wrong. The ones b'pnei chatoeinu golinu me'atzeinu. And she tells Hashem, even though they did this, Avodah Zarah, whatever, Shvichas Damim and Gilei Arayos, the worst Averis. That's Churban Bayis Rishon for the Gimel Averis. Still, just like where they go, I go, I'm there for them. And I was able to swallow my self-interests. And I wasn't jealous. So too you, Hashem, Kolshkem V'Kal V'Chema. Why are you getting upset? Forgive everything. You shouldn't look at it like it matters. Be bigger than that, because you are bigger than that. And those words, when she's a role model of her self-sacrifice, she turns to Hashem and tells Hashem to have his sacrifice, so to speak, go off the throne of judgment and severities and go on to the judgment of mercy and forgiveness. So that's a lesson. Now we have to think of the mothers. That's why I decided to speak about it today. Think about the mothers of the hostages. Think about the mothers of the soldiers, what they're going through. Their schus, their mesiras nefesh should end the war right now. And the lesson for us, we have to learn vatronis. The more every single one of us in our personal lives will practice this attribute of humility and forgiveness and not making a big deal about personal interest and desires and wills, but think more about what's good for the common good, that the other person should get the better of the deal. Then we could turn to Hashem and say, just like we're practicing this sort of attribute of humility and forgiveness, so to Hashem, please, please practice the attribute of mercy and let the other person get the benefit. And now, to answer the question, why all of a sudden now, maybe we could say, why does Yaakov mention this over here? Besides for the fact that he's asking Yosef to do this, maybe we could say another word. Right now, Yaakov was passing away. Leah passed away a long time ago, by the way. So, Yaakov is the last of the Avos and Imois. It's the end of the decade, whatever you call it, the era of the Avos, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. So the message that Yaakov is giving Yosef, yes, I'm the last one. But we, just like Rachel is there in place to be in a situation wherever there's golus, so in other words, she's there as support, as empowerment, even in a state of exile, even when there's darkness, even when it's the lowest point of abyss. For Klal Yisrael, Rachel will be there. And she gives her strength. And she comes out herself to plead for Am Yisrael. So this is what Yaakov is telling Yosef. Yes, I'm passing away now, but we have Rachel. And this is Chazak, V'nis Chazik in this week's Parsha. In addition to it, the Rebbe explains that Yaakov is being buried in Eretz Yisrael. I have no time to get into it. Yaakov is being buried in Eretz Yisrael. and Yosef's being buried in Egypt until Moshe Rabbeinu takes them out. These are all mechanisms of empowerment that a Jew, in whatever situation he is, he has an antidote. He has spiritual energies and spiritual forces to rise above whatever exile will throw at you. And that's also the message why it's important to bring it out now as Yosef is passing on. He's giving the message, as Yaakov is passing on, he's giving a message to Yosef that just like Rachel was there in a time of exile, there are forces, there are powers that will help you wherever you are, wherever you're going to be, including Egypt, including in the Egyptian exile, which is going to be coming, and etc., etc. So that's why it's also over here. So in summation, really we have no more time. I wanted to get into the idea. Let's go back to the verse that we mentioned before about Rachel represents the epitome of motherhood, of the sacrifice that she has for her children. And therefore the Rebbe explains in that Sikh and Chilik Lamed, that's why Jewishness is more attributed. Well, if your mother is a Jew, you're a Jew. Not if your father is a Jew and he marries, God forbid, a non-Jew. And why? Because the essential idea of Jewishness and the continuity of the Jewish nation and the secret of the Jewish nation is the mothers. They are the glue that hold it all together. Because they give birth to the Jew, and then they're there by the essential bond of mipi oil and v'yonkim for the first 5-6 years of the child's education and rearing. They are the ones who pass it on through their milk, through their attachment with their children, which is a kesher atzmis, more than anything else that could exist between two human beings, is the mother and the child. And that's why the Jewishness is attributed to the mother. And this also brings out the importance also of, it says that the Isha is the Akeres HaBayis. She's the main one who creates the culture of the home, connected to the continuation of the Judaism and the Jewishness that passes on from generation to generation. The Eibush should help that we should take the lesson of humility that we learned from Rachel and her self-sacrifice, and what it means self-sacrifice, and in her schus, and connecting this to the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam and their schus of Mesiras Nefesh and their lives, which you didn't have time to talk about. The Eibush should help that the war should end now. Everyone should be healthy. Begula mitzvah shleima, take it from Yad Mamish. Posting from my home, Be'ez Hashem Yisborach, your man in Melbourne.